All right, so hello and welcome back to Climbing Mount Sophia. We're back again with Jonathan Pageau, John Vervaeke, and David Schindler. So this is a continuation of the AI conversation. Last time, as I was talking about before we started recording, last time it felt like, I guess for me, the vibe of the conversation was there were sort of three particular perspectives that you each brought. You sort of stayed a little bit in your roles, I felt like. John as the cognitive scientist, David as the philosopher, and Jonathan as the religious symbolic thinker. I thought you all did a really fantastic job of bringing those perspectives. But I was hoping today that we could maybe drop down a little bit. So I haven't had a ton of time to prepare for this because I have a 10-day-old son.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I have a 1.5-year-old daughter. And last night I was thinking about this conversation as I was giving her a bath. And I thought, there's all these thoughts that come up, all the arguments, all these different things. And I thought, but there's this feeling underneath this whole thing for me. And it's this there's just sort of this nebulous dread. And so I was just sitting with that and just this question of like, well, I'm here with my daughter, I'm establishing relationship, I'm spending time with her. I value that so much. And there's something so special about that. And there's something about this question of AI, especially AGI, that throws some sort of a question mark in that whole moment for me. And I was thinking about, John, I got from you the idea of horror as being this sort of intercategorical, when things mix intercategorically. And I was thinking about it in that frame, because it feels like the AGI especially, and this notion of putting an AI in a body, like how far could we go if we embody these, if we get all 6 E's of cognition and all those things. And it's like there's an intercategorical feeling in the ontology of it. And in the sense that I think of technology as being sort of a layer superficial to us, right? Like we give technology its being in a sense. But the possibility that like we can give technology some being and then it actually drops down a level to the same level of being that we are. That's how it feels to me. I don't know if that's right, sort of technically, but that I'm trying to language this feeling and what I've sat with around the feeling. And I consider all three of you to be very, very wise. And I think that sense of how we all sit in front of this question, this sort of existential thing that is facing us in this AI. I don't know if it's a problem, advent, whatever it is. Yeah, so I'd like to start with maybe, can we just do some reflection about that? And maybe, David, you had, in your last point, in sort of your laying out your position in our last conversation, you had brought up how much do we change things and how much do things change us? And the AI might be changing us more than we're changing it. And so that question played a lot in my reflections leading to what I've just shared. So I don't know, maybe we can start with you and just start from there and do some reflections about, yeah, how do we make meaning? How do we sit with I don't know, just the existential strangeness and maybe horror, if that's the right thing, that we're faced with here.
Well, maybe we start by giving our daughters a bath. I just to reiterate the point from the last conversation. In the meantime, with some students, I read Josef Pieper's book, very small book, really worth reading, called Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power. And he presents language as the medium in which we have and enjoy our spiritual existence. It's a reality that connects us, our minds and so forth. And he then goes on to reflect when we abuse language, not simply use it improperly, but when the very form of the way we speak is impoverished, that impoverishes our existence generally, and it impoverishes our community and makes us vulnerable then to the abuse of power. And I think what is said there about language can be said about information technology more generally, that it really is, and increasingly so, is the medium. I mean, here we are on Zoom, right? It's the medium through which we connect to each other. And that makes it a really dramatic reality. There's something, it gives form, therefore, to our social connections and the way we exist, and in ways that are, I think, far more subtle and pervasive than we realized. And so I think we need to become increasingly attentive to that. And there would be a lot. I don't want to dominate too much time here. I could go on for a very long time about those kinds of things, but I won't. To come back to the image of giving your daughter a bath, I mean, that's such a powerful thing. Right now I'm teaching John, you'd appreciate this. I'm teaching a PhD seminar on sense perception and imagination, and we read some Gibson. I know that you and you know this. What has come back to me over the weeks of teaching this course over and over again is recovering a sense of what of the weight and depth and meaningfulness of our sense experience that goes far beyond simply the conveying of information. You know, there's something, we love the feel of water and the touch, skin against skin, to hold your daughter. I mean, think about, there's so much communication that's going on there that's not a transfer of information. And whatever else we say on this topic, that this rich topic that you've introduced, Ken, it seems to me one thing we have to say is, one thing that would certainly be at the center of it is to sort of recultivate the primacy of our sensible encounter with reality and the depth of meaning. You know, it's not just data, it's not just you know, information for use. There's something that we enjoy. You know, we enjoy, and we can't communicate. What does green look like? I mean, you just can't communicate that. And there's something about just the sheer delight in seeing green that is central to our humanity. And if those kinds of things, if we don't let them be displaced from the center of our existence, I think we will have a far saner perspective on what's going on with all of the new developments in technology. So that too would be something I could talk about forever, and I'll just you know, as an opening reflection, end with that.
It reminds me of, I saw a tweet from Elon Musk this last week that I think he said something like parenting is 20 years of prompt engineering. And I responded to it, and I was like, I mean, I didn't get any response from him, obviously, but I was like, no, that's exactly what it's not. Like that's an element of it, but like it's not the
engineering
data.
is not the word you want to use.
Yeah, and it's not the prompts. Like I'm so in the thick of the early childhood thing, and it's like it's not the prompts, it's the being together with them.
Yeah. You know, I wanted to come back, Ken, to your idea, like the question of the feeling of horror, and just bring up, our imagination has been dealing with these questions for a long time. The question of the artificial human or the artificial being, And so we have a storehouse of images that we deal with, from, and especially obviously during the Romantic period, or when things were starting to happen in the 19th century, you see that become more prominent. The story, obviously Frankenstein, the Golem, all of these stories, they're part of our storehouse of images. And the relevance of Frankenstein, I think, is particularly important right now, especially as we understand that, especially the LLMs, for example, right now, they're made out of dead language, right? They're basically made out of all of this writing that we created in the history of humanity, and now we're trying to zap electricity into it, and bring it to life. If we add the body to that, like the idea of an artificial biological body, we're adding a whole other layer. And the same with the golem. I mean, the golem is a good example of the problem of technology itself, which is, the idea that technology is a layer, or a layer of defense, or a layer of strength that we add to human intention, and how it turns against us like ultimately. So, the image of, I mean, obviously the Matrix is the more recent example, but all of these image, or Terminator, all of these things, and I would say that, we could say, oh, this is science fiction, so, and it's ridiculous to take science fiction as fact, but there's a reason why humans project things into the imaginary space. In some ways, it's a way of preparing ourselves. It's a way of trying to predict what's coming. It's a way to deal with things that we can't calculate, but that are coming at us. And so we kind of project it into this imagistic space in order to be able to grasp it. So these images have to be taken seriously and contended with, as we move forward into these spaces, because I have a weird idea about these types of projections into imagistic space, which is that it seems like they are self-fulfilling prophecies to some extent. you know a good example that I see, which is a silly one, but it's a good example, is witch trials, in the early modern period, which is, we don't really know whether or not the witches really existed, and like how much of it was like imaginary projection as Christianity was waning. But what we know is that a lot of the things that they predicted, or that they saw, ended up coming at them later in culture. And the idea of the kind of castrating witch, like all of these types of images that we see in the witch trials, these end up manifesting themselves later in history in very strange and surprising ways. So I think that we have to take the images of fiction very seriously, and not take them as just fun stories, or just the human fears gone astray, but really as attempts to project into the future, attempts to project into imaginary space things that we haven't grasped with yet. So those images are important to think about.
Hmm.
And the question would be, like, are there, even in our, I mean, John is a science fiction person more than I am. So like, are there prominent stories about the AI? There is the Star Trek 1. In that story, there is a kind of a positive AI, where the AI returns and joins almost sexually with humans, at the end of Star Trek 1. So there are a few images of positive AI, you know, uh, let's say, kind of more utopian stories, but it seems like most of them are rather dark.
I don't know if I could sort of do a quick survey that would have any accuracy. There's definitely positive, neutral, and negative images, and of course, there's images in which the AI have been made adorable, like in Star Wars, R2-D2 and C-3PO,
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
And so, but Jonathan, I don't know. I hesitate to give any definitive answer. All I would say that I think is clear is that there's representations from all three categories: negative, negative, neutral, and positive. And I think that goes towards your point of there's this imaginary exploration, and then you're concerned that it could become imaginal and therefore shape us and shape the world. I think that's something we should talk about. I think that's very important. I'll go back to Ken's point, and then I'll try and comment on some themes from both of you. When I heard about ChatGPT 4, because I was not impressed by ChatGPT 3, it seemed to have ChatGPT 4 was a step up, and because it was not presented academically, but through sort of corporate marketing, it was unclear what that step was. And that, of course, that indistinctness, indeterminacy added to horror. I was experiencing profound horror. I walked around in a state of intense horror. I felt called to devote everything I had in terms of my capacities and my knowledge to try and come up with a viable response to this, because the horror was so pronounced for me. Now, remember, I'm not making predictions about when these machines are going to be 6E or anything like that. I'm just but the fact that we had taken this step forward, and to my mind, in which the technology had exceeded the science and the philosophy and the spirituality, and I've made that argument already, I won't repeat it. That was part of the horror for me, because it felt like these things were swinging free of those normal domains, those three domains in which we try to gain knowledge and wisdom about the world. And that was like the worst possible outcome. So not only what they were in themselves, if I can put it that way, but how they were generated was causing horror in me. I'd always hoped that, these machines would come out of scientific advanced and philosophical reflection, and that's not what they are. And that, for me, is particularly horrific, because I think it is a reasonable prediction that where we don't have knowledge, wisdom, and spiritual reflection, we will act foolishly. And so that is part of the horror for me. There's another part of the horror. I think it is inevitable, and this goes towards David's point, that we'll see a cyborg stage. The neural link is now being improved, and we cyborg, except for your naked bodies and the atmosphere around you, everything around you is a tool, including your clothing, right? And we are natural born cyborgs, and this has been one of our distinct cultural advantages for a long time. And I think the temptation to cyborg will be intense, and that's also part of the horror, because we are already at a stage in our cultural reflection where we're not clear what it is to be human. And then the idea that David made about language being displaced from us, and I think that point in a point I'm concerned about. I think the potential, I don't think it has been realized, and we can argue at some point about whether or not we agree what the probability of that potential is. But I think there's a real potential for this to be qualitatively different technology, and that these beings will not be tools, they will become agents of some kind. Now, I'm not saying they'll have full-blown personhood or anything, but they'll have agency, at least the agency perhaps of animals. And that's a different kind of thing. And if we displace language onto agents that do not belong to our cultural historical ontology, that will be also seriously horrifying for us. Now, I think, so for me, those were the sort of, they remain the three sources of horror for me. All of those put me into an intercategorical state. We've got this technology that's exceeding our knowledge and our wisdom. We have the displacement of language and agency that were always normally just bound together in us. We were unique about that. And then we just have this general sense from these machines that we are going to merge with them in ways that will no doubt be driven largely by market forces, which do not have our best interest at heart. So those are the three dimensions of me that cause horror. I just wanted to pick up on a couple things, a couple more things. I think David is right to point to the depth of the ineffable and the richness of our experience. I would also point to the heights of the ineffable in our experiences of ecstasis, because we find the ineffable at both of those ends. And this is why I think that what I call the spiritual somatic axis will become central if we're going to go to a place where we are going to find an axis mundi to preserve our humanity. And this is why I mean, and people, and this goes to what Jonathan said also about the imaginary becoming the imaginal and taking proper responsibility. This is what I keep saying when I think theology is the discipline that is going to be our best resource for dealing with horror. I mean, it's no coincidence that theology and horror are bound up together, right? That's not a coincidence. And I think horror shows us about these horrific intercategorical potentials. And when it's good horror, which is rare, right? Most horror is silly. But when it's good horror, we're thrown back onto, I think, often that spiritual somatic pole, whereby we recover our humanity, and that's what we actually use. And there's something around a sense of presence that I think all of you are pointing to, and especially Ken with your daughter, that is the disclosure of that somatic spiritual pole. And you can call it spiritual somatic because I think the emanation and the emergence are completely interpenetrating. And I'm not going to repeat that argument, right? I think there's something about that. And one of the interesting things about it is it is precisely that which it escapes our textualization. One of the things I would like to do with one of these machines is say, do all the work on John Vervaeke's relevance realization, get it all, really understand it. Now improve your own processing with that knowledge. Of course, it won't be able to do that. And so I just think, and I find it odd that I'm the person sort of doing this, but it's where the argument is leading me. I think this theological axis of the spiritual somatic, which of course is typified profoundly in the incarnation in Christianity, right? Just to make an obvious symbolic gesture. I think that is that by which we have to respond to the horror and the imaginal possibilities of self-fulfilling prophecy. So that would be my reflection.
It's so interesting that you brought in both the question, how our sense of what it means to be human is in question. Like that feels very important to me. I mean, because that felt true to me before AI even became a big topic. You know, in my background, I'm coming out of a very sort of Anabaptist Protestant Christianity, where it was all about affirming that, you know, Jesus literally is God and man, since you brought in the incarnation as well. And it's like, now, like I talk to a lot of people who are in that are still in that space, and they'll try to pin me down with that sort of question. And I'll say, well, I can't really answer that question because that would require me to say that I know what both of those poles are. Like I would have to know what it means to be God and what it means to be man to like claim that I truly know the answer to that. And there's something about that I hear when you invoke theology and the question of being human and horror and all those things that does get bound up around, you know, this deep narrative that we have of the incarnation. I don't know if we necessarily want to go down that road or not, but this idea of like, what does it mean to be human, in that we do find ourselves as sort of intercategorical in the sense that we stretch to the ineffable above us and to the ineffable below us, that we almost find ourselves as intercategorical beings in a sense.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's definitely a difference between intercategorical in the sense of monstrosity and then synthetic in the sense of joining two opposites together. So humans in some ways are synthetic beings. That is, we bring together, you know, we tend to bring together the invisible and the visible world in our capacity to name and to participate in identity recognition and formation, the idea of the intercategorical is more an experience of liminality and confusion, like in this in-between space where we don't know, what's happening and what is it we're dealing with. This is definitely one of the experiences that we have, at least that I have, of AI, even the LLMs, when you're interacting with them, because you sort of get a sense that you're dealing with intelligence, and then all of a sudden that you're not, but it's this weird kind of place where you have no idea what you're actually dealing with in terms of a spiritual encounter with something. And so, and it's the same when you imagine the idea of the cyborg itself as a hybrid between two categories of the tool and the being, and and so there's a sense in which humans participate in liminality and hybridity and intercategorical aspects, but usually we understand it as the outside, right? So it's like you wear clothing, you don't have clothing like in your mind. You write outside, and you create these things around you that are kind of intercategorical. But the idea of Neuralink and the idea of the intelligent machine, all of these things, and even information technology already, is bringing the intercategorical into the experience. Like it's kind of bringing it inside, and that's what makes it different in some ways from the usual, like the normal procession of externalities, right? So you have a house, you have clothing, you have all these things outside to protect you. But if you bring the tool and you make your mind only a tool, or if you bring the tool in your mind, then it's a different level. At least that's my, so the image, I mean, I hate going to Revelation because people always understand it wrong, but in the sense that I'm saying it's the end of the world. But the categories described there, they're really powerful to understand what I'm talking about, which is that if you worship the beast, like if you worship the technical system, or if you worship the whatever, the technology, the civilization, that's when you have the problem, right? But if you worship the Son of Man, like if you worship God in man, man in God, this joining point of all reality, then the civilization and externalities lay themselves out properly. So you have the image of the heavenly Jerusalem with the Son of Man above. That's the right order. But if you worship the beast and you worship the image of the beast, then everything falls apart. You fall into tyranny, you fall into confusion, you fall into desire. All of these things fall apart. And this is, John's bringing up the problem of AI as a product, like as that we understand that these things are there to elicit our desires. We have to consume them, like everything about it. And then people kind of giving over their authority to these computers as they desire them, and all of the forces that are like rolling the thing forward. Desire for power, desire to fulfill your, to create AI porn, or whatever it is that's driving the technology. All of these things are leading us in the direction of the monster, like
I mean, and then I mean, one of the most horrifying dimensions of that is that we're receiving desire. It's not that we have these human desires that then we're finding these ways to satisfy, but in a certain sense, we're ceding not just authority, but we're ceding our desire to things that then are reinterpreting us in such a radical way. Be interesting to reflect on. I find it really fascinating, Ken, that you chose the word horror to think about this. You think of what is horror, and what the relationship between horror or and fear. What's the distinction between horror and fear, or just being scared, or then positive things like joy. Why is it that we associate horror? It seems to me one of the things that one could say, and I think Heidegger's got a lot of very interesting reflections on these kinds of experiences. But there's something in horror. There's something about he uses the word unheimlich, uncanny is the way it gets translated, and the German is so much more interesting. Unheimlich, it has the word heim, home. You know, this to be the experience of the uncanny. It seems it's a homelessness. You're being sort of displaced from your proper integrating, to use Jonathan's notion of synthesis. You know, you're being displaced from this kind of integrating center, and I think that's why, you know, our initial reaction to these things, why horror is the one that sort of stands out. There's something that it's such a radical experience, different from the kind of superficial instances of fear, you know, normal fear.
Yeah, it's the strange. It's the experience of strangeness, like
Yeah.
the experience of undefined, and you can't see. It's like a monster that appears as a puzzle. You know,
Yeah.
the idea of the Sphinx as this image of the poses a riddle to you,
Yeah.
and it's like, unless you figure this riddle out, it's gonna eat you. You know.
And it's speaking inside you as much as outside you. That's the thing that's so
Well,
unnerving.
yeah. So, I mean, I've done some work on horror, and trying to get a little bit clearer about how it's different from fear. And most horror movies are not horror movies. They're startle and puncture movies. They're movies in which something leaps out and bites us or consumes us. And so they just play on our ancient fear of predation. And I really don't know why people enjoy that. I guess it's stimulating or something. I find that silly. Um, so, but where there's genuine horror, generally what's happening is what's not being threatened is your physical existence. Your sanity is under threat. So what's typically happening in horror are people are feeling that they're losing a grip on themselves and reality, or both. And we have this different affective response to say, hey, you're losing it. You're losing it. Like, it's getting out of, like, you're right, which is very different from, here's a really significant problem like a tiger. Right? You can have tremendous fear, but it's not the same thing as horror, because you know exactly what's going on. It's not like, whoa, I'm losing it. Your sanity isn't in question. Your life's in threat. And so you have an affective response for that. But you have an affective response for your sanity being threatened, right? Which is horror. And I think the fact that these things have to do with the mind in some very powerful way, the uncanny sort of reflection, as if in a nightmare, of mental properties, I think, and because they're mental in that way, they threaten, right, our sense of sanity, and that's what gives them their particular horrific edge. One of the greatest moments of horror I had was in The Shining. I'm watching this movie and I have my intellectual arrogance running, and I know what he's talking about. You know, this is a metaphor for alcoholism, and I know he hates it and all that, and he's going insane. And I was all very pleased with myself. And then the Jack Nicholson character gets trapped in the pantry, and he's talking to the voices in his head, and I go, yeah, 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 yeah. But he's locked in from the outside, and then they let him out, and the door
Yeah,
opens.
that's definitely an example of horror.
Yeah, don't give away too much. I still have not
Oh,
seen
yeah.
Oh, okay.
the
Well,
movie.
oh, sorry. I thought we could see.
Yeah, that's definitely a manifestation of intercategorical
Yeah.
like breaking.
Well, yeah, because, and my sense of I know what's going on was broken. And
Yeah.
so right. And there was no simulated threat. It's just a door opening. Right. It's just a door opening, and there's nothing else going on. There's no terror at all. There's no fear. There was just like, I don't know what's going on. I fundamentally don't know what's going on. And so I think these machines, because they go to the guts of our sense of what mentality is, they have a capacity to threaten our sense of our grip on our mentality, our sanity, and that's why they're so capable of triggering horror. That would be the argument I would make.
I think, especially if you think of mentality as our spiritual condition. I mean, to use a theological categories, it's and to connect this also with this notion of you know, I mentioned displacement for you know, the classical vision. So we've talked about the incarnation, even the classical teaching on creation places man in a certain sense at the center, precisely center, which doesn't mean the highest. There's, you know, there's the modern radical misunderstanding of the meaning of that has led to all sorts of ecological crises. But in the, you know, the ancient understanding is man is at the center precisely as this synthesis of spirit and matter, to use that language, that characterizes everything properly human. I tell students, you know, that human beings by nature were both hobbits and mystics,
Yeah.
and each one of those, you know, what's more essentially human? I mean, you couldn't they're both essentially human, and it's a paradox. So I like the language of paradox here. There's something about this, the synthesis of the infinite and the finite, this, you know, the spiritual, the transcendent and the immanent, the spirit and flesh and so forth, that has a in the properly human heart at the center, has a kind of a paradoxical character where these dimensions are intertwined and interpret each other, just like you said, you know, in a way that the spiritual and somatic, they're both excesses of the conceptual in different directions, and they interpret each other. I think that's essential to the human condition. I really like, Jonathan, what you're saying about this, the intercategorical as a confusion of that. And maybe one way to put that's really suggestive to me. Maybe another way to think about it too would be that what the intercategorical is not a paradoxical synthesis from the beginning, but you take parts that have been separated from each other and you try to stick them back. You stick them into each other in ways that are not. They're no longer really paradoxical. They just become confusions and contradictions and dialectical, and, you know, in ways that have no real intelligibility. There's a kind of, to come back to the way that these disturb our fundamental mental roots, I think is telling.
I think that there's a way, and to me this is with a hopeful aspect, you know, I want to offer a little bit of hope somehow, is that there's a manner in which the intercategorical is a transition. It's a transition between two states, and that horror of mismatch and of hybridity, right? It's this transition moment, and so that's why hybrids are represented in between spaces, whether it's the Sphinx or the cherub, or if it's the marginalia in a manuscript. Like, you have these places where things break down, and there's inversion, and there's all this hybridity and strangeness and aspects which completely break the normal categories. And so there is a sense in which it is possible for that to be used as a vehicle for more. Like, I think that that's possible. You know, the image of Saint Christopher carrying Christ across the waters, right? The idea of the hybrid monster or the giant or the whatever, you know, being the one that carries the logos to the next step is also a possibility. And so if you think, the water crossing is a good example, right? The idea of, like, you come to a point, you know, you're at the limit, so you need a vehicle to cross over, and that vehicle is ambiguous. It's a hybrid, it's a monster, and there's the possibility that it'll eat you, or there's a possibility that it'll carry you across, depending on your relationship to it. I think the Sphinx is really one of the best examples to understand this experience of horror, which is that the Sphinx poses a riddle, that he presents reality in a manner that is completely not understandable. The categories are broken. Like, what is this thing that's four things, and that is you know, that is not the same? And the answer is man, right? That's the answer. The incarnation ends up being the answer to beating the Sphinx. And so I think that even in that story, we have an image of what it is we're talking about, which is that understanding or participating in the incarnation, and let's say going back into what it is to be human in the way that Ken talked about, is a way to beat the Sphinx, but not only to beat it, but in some ways maybe to make it your pet, to make it the thing that you mount and that you ride, you know, to the next step.
there's yeah, there is something really hopeful here, I think, and I think it is right exactly what you're saying here, Jonathan. I got this sense as so David, when you talked about that sense of displacement in horror, the uncanny, the loss of home, something that's been really important for me from John's work is the introduction to the notion of domicide. And because that is, I would say, core to my identity, like across a lot of layers. And one of the things that I think, then when you were talking about horror, John, is this questioning of our sanity. And it's like one of the things that I notice about the modern world is we're all very sure that we're sane. Like we're often too sure that we're sane, that we know things, that we, that we know what's going on. And Jonathan, some of your talks have really helped me to get out of that way of thinking of the scientific world where everything's over there, and instead bringing us back into the center of reality. And it's like, well, maybe what AI is doing is it is this monster to carry us over the water, in the sense of saying, yeah, you need to leave the home because you're in a false home. Like this home of modern technology that we live in, most of us live in or have lived in. It doesn't work anymore. Like you're dropped out of it, you're displaced out of it, and we have to find a way back to a proper incarnation, right? That back into the depths of our senses, like you talked about earlier, David. I mean, and to bring it one more time to the incarnation point, I don't go to church. I don't know if I'm a Christian or not exactly, but um, someone really close to me, very close to me, had a true psychiatric breakdown over the last 6 months. And this is a very, very sane person, very orderly, very totally unexpected. And because it was in my family, it was truly horrifying in that it got at that root sense of like, can I trust my own sanity?
Mm-hmm.
And what I found was the way out every time for me was to go back to the notion of incarnation and actually the person of Jesus. And I don't know where that's left me exactly, but that just feels like something worth bringing in here, that every time I got dropped personally, this is just my personal narrative. Like every time I got dropped into that space where I was like truly in horror of how do I trust my own sanity? There was some sense of like, I don't really know, but there's something about being human. There's something about being in touch with my body and being human and just sitting with the person of Jesus. That's about as far as I can take it. It's hard to language it. That provided me a tie that I could that never has failed me yet.
So I'd like to respond to a lot of this. I think there's a lot that's going on here that's really powerful. The last thing you said there, Ken, I think our sanity is grounded in the proper, and I mean this word in all of its senses, appreciation of our humanity. This is the Platonic argument. We have to hold in tonos our finitude and our transcendence. And this is what and that's the somatic spiritual. And when we plug into that and we hold the tonos and we hold to it, we not only hold it, we hold to it. We give account of it and we make ourselves accountable to it. I think that is the source of our sanity. I think right now of the Heart of Darkness, I'm going to be teaching this soon in the literature of the meaning crisis. And the horror of Kurtz is he abandons that tonos and he pursues pure transcendence. And the horror of that, because he's fundamentally losing his humanity. Whereas Marlowe will continue the quest. He's continuing to pursue the relationship to the transcendent, the numinous, but he he takes an oath to himself of restraint. He will not abandon his humanity. He will not abandon his finitude. But he doesn't fall into the despair of all the people around them who are going crazy because they're getting crushed by the immensity, right? This is why he's such a fantastic hero. He keeps the two together, and he's able to take the quest journey. And so I would say, that, and I'm not denying the Christian, transfiguration of this Platonic idea. I'm not trying to, hey, you played Jesus, here's Plato. I'm not doing that. That's not what's happening here. But I do say that that Platonic argument, I think, is one of the most powerful ones. And I want, and I want to say something. I'm reading, and this goes towards can we find an aperture of hope? This goes towards the intercategorical. But the intercategorical, and this is something that Buddhism plays with, right? That sometimes if you can properly stabilize yourself and hold on to those, the aperture of horror, that intercategorical space actually allows you to see a blind spot, which is a really powerful notion. You realize, right? And I'm reading Evan Thompson's book, The Blind Spot, right now, and he's making an argument. I'm going to talk to him this week, very similar to the argument I've made about how we are the blind spot within the scientific worldview.
Yeah.
Right? We have this scientific worldview in which we, as embodied meaning makers and normativity, responders and all of that, we don't fit into that. We don't fit in. That's why we're homeless. But I think that's a problem that causes the meaning crisis. But there's a thread in there, and like if we properly orient, the thread is, well, that's exactly where we are seeing what these machines won't be getting.
Yeah.
Because it's not in the scientific worldview,
Mm.
right? Now, it's horrific to look through that because it's deeply intercategorical. And the horror, I think, is the meaning crisis. Because it's like, we're homeless. But if we could get to a place where we could properly center, right? I keep doing that axis mundi, right? Then we can do the Buddhist trick of reframing, where we look through it and we say, but that points to what is not captured by the scientific worldview right now. And that's a different thing than these machines in a powerful, powerful way. And so I just wanted to, and I'm not trying to retrospectively do something, but I think it's honest for me to say I was trying to I think I'm making the argument maybe even better right now, and I thank you all for it. But that's the argument I was trying to get to in the third part of my video essay, that we have to tap in to what's missing in this scientific worldview in order to have a place from which we can respond to these machines. Because the problem with them in terms of them being intercategorical and in other ways is there's a suspicion, and that's all it is. There's a suspicion that unlike all the other times we've encountered the uncanny, except for the religious, I'll put that over here, we've been able to make the categorical changes that we go through the paradigm shifts. But there's a lot of people who are concerned that these machines will exceed our conceptual capacities. And that's also, I think, a suspicion in here. But I think these machines will only exceed the conceptual capacities that are given to us by the standpoint of the scientific worldview. And the blind spot, I think, is something that if we could properly preserve our anchoring in our humanity, we could see through and see where it is that these machines are doomed to not capture essential parts of our humanity.
Yeah, that's such an amazing point. I mean, and I think it is a point that gives you hope in the sense that one of the things the AI will do possibly is that in some ways the hope is that it'll make what is human shine even more.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because even as it becomes more powerful and maybe powerful beyond what we can imagine now, this blind spot, this thing that's missing from the rationalistic, scientific and technical point of view will become more glaring and will force us into some extent to be human. Like will force us to be more human, even for our own survival. Like because for example, even in the idea, if you think about, like, if we identify, for example, with our jobs and what we do and all of these things, like, these things might be taken away from us. We don't even
Very
know
much.
yet exactly what's going to happen. And so then what? Like, what does it mean to be human? Does it mean to just entertain ourselves and watch TV and watch videos and play video games and whatever? Like, because at some point that's going to run out, you know, as the AIs start to scratch at the definition of what we think a human is. That's a great point. I actually never thought about that.
Okay, and I just, can I say one thing, David? Because I don't want there's a point to my point.
Yeah.
What I mean is there's a corresponding point. I think facing the blind spot is very difficult for us, though. I think what I'm trying to say is there's two horrors that are sort of keeping each other. There's the horror of the meaning crisis. To really face that is to feel unhomed, right? And I think the meaning crisis is evident that looking at, let alone looking through that aperture, is very hard for us. And so I think you're right. I think it has, if we can look through it, I think it has the possibility of disclosing to us a deeper humanity, the one that has not been caught by modernity. That's my argument. But I don't want to lose the other point I'm trying to make, which is, but turning so that we can properly look through that aperture. I mean, we've already been talking about that for the last 5 years, to my mind, about how difficult and profound that is, what that will take as well. I just wanted to make sure that doesn't get lost.
Yeah, because
mean,
also
so
the
maybe
increasing
there's-
power is a kind of drunkenness. Like, we
Yeah.
have to be aware of that. There's a drunkenness to this kind of increasing capacity and power and capacity to do whatever I want, to manifest whatever desire I have, whatever thought I have, to right away get, you know, to have all my questions answers. All of these things are give the, let's say, increase the possibility of a kind of a drunken madness.
You know, on that very point, you know, another source of hope is that we might, you know, as John, you say, this is very difficult to do, but the crisis might be such that we have no choice. I mean, in a way, we're sort of, it compels us. We to survive. We need to recover the sense of what is human, and I'd like to think about what that is. I was struck from the last conversation we had on precisely this point that you're making more explicit here, but one of the things that can be a genuine gain through all of this is it forces us to make explicit, maybe than we've been able to do before, what is specifically human about our experience. And you know, one dimension of it will certainly be, you know, whatever you can get AI to do, you can't get it seems to me, and I'd like to hear if I'm wrong about this. It's hard to imagine a machine wanting to know what green looks like and to desire to just simply experience it. I mean, that seems to me that very notion of just enjoying it and desiring it for its own sake, that's something that's really hard to imagine, because that moves out of the category of, it moves to the categories of being rather than just function. It could, I mean, I think I have no doubt whatsoever that we can make it look like it's desiring these things, but that seems to me that there's a, you know, to bring back the platonic question, there's the radical difference between being and seeming in the end. And even if that's hard to see, because all of our seeing passes through seeming, we can't let go that there's a difference between being and seeming, or all is lost. So that's one thing. And a question I'd like to raise, and this would bring us in a different direction, so maybe we'll just set it aside, but I would like to put it on the table. It's just, you know, through all this, it prompts this question, you know, why did we make AI? Why do this? Why put ourselves in this position? What were we thinking? I mean, I think that's an important question to ask, because even asking that will reveal something about the humanity behind the phenomenon.
Well, I think, honestly, I really do believe that there is a deep unconscious desire to be superseded. Right? I do believe that. I believe that it's ingrained in revolutionary tropes from Hesiod's Theogony, that there is a sense in which once we engage in a way of thinking that is revolutionary, that is the possibility of rising up on our own and taking, from that which is above us, whether it's political, whether it's the scientific revolution, all of these ways of thinking. But this process is secretly installing in us the inevitability and desire even to be superseded by something. And so whether you imagine it, however you imagine the things we make come and take from us, like we castrated the gods, at some point in our story. I don't think that's the only process, but at least for the futurists, like at least for those that are doing this ideologically, there seems to be that desire to be superseded.
Well, could I pick up on that, and the Promethean spirit that is at work in the scientific revolution? Of course, there's other quite virtuous motives at work in the scientific revolution, which is like, let's understand the physical world so we can reduce human suffering. Let's not forget that's one of the things that powered the scientific revolution. And why I say that is because the proposal of AI comes right out of the scientific revolution. It's made by Hobbes, right? And it's the proposal that this science that is disclosing everything can ultimately explain us. And then the idea is the way we could explain us is to make, because the maker understands what they have made, which of course is paradoxically not where we're at, but I'll get to that in a sec. And the idea is we would complete the scientific worldview through the AI project. So AI is originally a scientific project, and why it's going on in the universities, I was there, was scientifically, right? The people were not motivated by specific, economic gain or things, or most of them, people that I knew of, they were doing it because they thought and I think they were sincere and correct. They were doing science, but what was happening is, as the academic world is doing the science, technologies are spitting off, right? And the technologies are generating tremendous wealth. And so and then they start to get coupled together. The strong AI project of a scientific project, and then the weak AI project of just making these economically valuable machines get going. And what we've now seen, and what I've dreaded, is that this side, the economic monster, has completely severed itself from the scientific project. And so how we got here, I agree with Jonathan. I think there's the Promethean thing, but I think there was also a scientific project. And then what's happened is what you might call a socioeconomic engineering project has pulled free to a very significant degree from the scientific project. And therefore, it's not being held back even by the constraints of good science, right? Which is like, yeah.
If I could jump in there, what do you all think of? One of my colleagues, Michael Hamby, has been making this argument, and I find it very compelling. And he's basing it on Hans Jonas in a certain sense, and Heidegger too. But the idea that modern science, was technological from the outset. In a certain sense, technology isn't just an accidental implication of the scientific revolution, but the very revolution had a kind of technological form. And then he takes that further and says technology has always had the inner form of biotechnology, and biotechnology has always had the inner form of a kind of transhumanistic project. So there was something sort of inevitable. And one can give that a strong and weak reading, but there's a certain kind of inevitability in the scientific revolution to the kind of transhumanistic implications that would push the point you're making, John, a little bit. But I don't know. I mean, which is not to say that there were some evil genius in the beginning that planned to profit from all this, and sort of that. I actually think that argument can coincide with a genuine desire to improve the human condition and
I think it is.
alleviates suffering. So I don't mean to call that into question in the least. In fact, I think in a way, I mean, that's one of the things that makes some of this so diabolical, is that it's the very desire to improve the world that's used as an engine to introduce these
Yeah, I think
themes.
that's why it's well named the Promethean spirit.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
It's the Promethean spirit. It's not just a satanic spirit. It's a Promethean spirit, but the Promethean spirit carries with it great risk. I agree, by the way, with the Heideggerian. I do think science and technology have been interwoven, and that's why when people say they can just reject the scientific worldview, they're talking foolishly, because they're enmeshed in technology. But so my argument, I hope, was a little bit more subtle. I was trying to say, yes, they were like that, right? And then because this had a socioeconomic value that was unforeseen, this has to some degree become autonomous from the science. That's the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that point.
Yeah.
Well,
so
I mean, it's the
go ahead.
basic problem of human knowledge from the beginning, or like applicable human knowledge, and it's the problem of the increase in power, because knowledge increases your power, but as soon as you increase your power, then the temptation is always there. It doesn't go away, and the more you increase your power, the more the temptation is powerful. And so how do you mitigate between the two? How do you find the balance so your increase in power doesn't lead to war and to all the things that it has in the past?
Right. And then the response.
Could I qualify though that I always get a little nervous. I'm sure we would all agree in some version of this, but there are different kinds of knowledge, that the identification of knowledge, it's not knowledge as such that increases power. It's already knowledge that would be a certain kind of revolutionized form. I mean, I think if you think that knowledge at its root is, if you were to define knowledge, and I think in the classical tradition, you could, biblically, platonically, and so forth, that knowledge is the soul's love of the real, of the true, good, and the beautiful, and participation in reality. That doesn't immediately evoke a sense of power. I think it's been co-opted already when it's associated with power. And that's just a qualification. I'm sure we all.
I think I agree that that's important. This is why I talk about the other kinds of knowing.
Yeah.
I would be very, I would do this. I would say that a kind of power is given when you have a kind of predictive knowledge, right? Where you can make, nomological predictions that are context invariant, which is not the same kind of knowledge I get from my beloved, right? Right. So if I think we're all nodding. We're agreeing. We're going to limit that, and then I think, and that limitation is the scientific revolution greatly empowered that part. Right, it allowed us to engineer the world. We'd always been engineering the world, but it was a difference of degree that became a difference of kind. And then the hope was we could get a kind of self-knowledge that would give us power over ourselves, so that we would control ourselves. And you're both smiling, as you should, because there's all kinds of problems sewn into that proposal. But I think that weird circle that I'm drawing right now, I think that's where the AI sits. It sits very much in that, and this is how people still talk about it. We're going to make these machines, and then they're going to, right? They're going to tell us more and more, and we're going to get power over ourselves. And it's like, well, not if they're actually embodying a propositional tyrannization of knowledge and a reduction of knowledge to predictive manipulative control and a loss of conformity to the real. Then it won't do that for it. It will just increasingly derealize us, even though it's giving us more power. And so I'm not saying anything that you're not saying. I'm just trying to draw out explicitly what I think is going on there.
I mean, Jonathan evoked the Sphinx here. I mean, that's really helpful to come back to that, especially in Sophocles' version with the Oedipus Rex. I mean, that there you did have a kind of an Oedipus, knowledge is power, and it's interesting. You know, the resolution is a kind of know thyself, coming to understand what man is. So entering, but precisely by being blinded, you know, losing this power to dominate the outside world and having to turn within and have a concrete, real foundation. So man, not in the abstract, but in this entering into the universal, but precisely through something very concrete and interior.
But this is the blind spot, right? Because what actually drives even the best science is a profound epistemic humility.
Yeah.
And that humility is not taken account of in this model, right? That's really, really like the Promethean spirit puts the humility aside. And the fact that there's no positive sense to the word humiliation anymore, I think is really telling for our society. It's like, no, 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 we should never lose our sense of status. And of course, there's a kernel of truth in that. We shouldn't slip into bestiality. But there's also, again, I come back to, can we recover that proper commitment to finite transcendence that is our humanity's home? And that plugs us into the two ineffable poles. This is what I keep saying when I think this is a theological problem, ultimately. There's a theological problem about recovering our true humanity in the face of what is ultimately real.
Wonder, like, it seems to me like there's a really important value to be placed on suffering, that especially since the scientific revolution, like we haven't properly given suffering a value.
In what sense? Do you mean of undergoing, or of, because it literally means just undergoing, right?
Yeah.
Or do you mean distress and pain, or loss of agency? Which do you mean? Because the problem is we have these two meanings running around right now, and I just want clarification.
Yeah, it's massively conflated. And I think it's more the loss of agency, the undergoing, to be genuinely finite, that in the scientific revolution, like, and that's part of why we mix them, right? It's like you get you get more oomph, you get more people supporting your project if you're, hey, I'm trying to cure children's cancer, and then you slip in a few things where you're trying to ameliorate the loss of agency altogether. And, you know, gain of function research, these sorts of things. And like I work in medicine, and so I'm like, the sense of physical suffering that people undergo and the distress that they go through with that. I'm thinking of a patient that I had a couple of weeks ago specifically, who we had a very straightforward conversation, because it was, her option was she could have her leg amputated or she would die. And if she was okay with having her leg amputated, there was a pretty good chance that she would live and do just fine. But if she didn't, there was no way she was going to live. Like, her foot was dead. And she was in her early 70s, sweet lady, otherwise pretty healthy. And, you know, we had a whole conversation about it. And for her, ultimately, her decision was, I'd rather pass away. Like, I've had a good enough life. I'm ready to go. But we had a lot of conversation about how much are you willing to suffer? How much are you willing to undergo a certain limitation of your agency with the loss of your leg? And one thing that I found really special about that interaction was that she didn't want to die because she would lose agency. It wasn't that she didn't want the suffering of losing her leg and the loss of agency and the limitation of her life, but it was actually a fullness of the life that she had already lived, which strikes me as sort of the opposite of so many other people, where it's just give me the maximum agency for as long as possible. There's no sense of fulfillment. There's just this desire for more, and that speaks to that, I think, revolutionary spirit that you were talking about, Jonathan. It's like, I always want to grab more and to push down, instead of properly valuing that there is only a certain space made available to me. and that space has genuine, real limits to it, and that I actually gain agency and I gain connection to the good and genuine deep knowledge in the way that David, you talked about earlier, by actually embracing not necessarily the pain. I want to ameliorate like senseless pain in that as much as I can, but to actually genuinely appreciate the undergoing of suffering.
Mm.
I mean, part of the Promethean project is a conflation of all of that. And because if you can conflate all of those, then you can address them with the increase in predictive power, right? And so this is why I've been really harping on, we need to separate out these senses of suffering, and to understand that if you're going to retain your humanity, you have to maintain the other sense of suffering. I agree with you, senseless pain and distress and premature death and all of that, and the scientific revolution, let's be responsible here, has radically reduced all of that. I mean, and for literally billions of people, this is part of why it's not going away, right? But I think if you're a finite being and you hold on to your finite being, you are identifying with suffering. And I'm trying to be very strong here, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm identifying with suffering. I love Sarah, and because of that, I suffer. And sometimes that suffering is even distress. You know, when I was with Jonathan in Nashville, I was missing her tremendously. I don't want to shut that off. I don't want to. It's because I'm finite. I'm bound in time and space and blah blah, right? And I don't want to leave that as abstractions. I really want to stay with that and really, right, undergo that, because that's part of what love is. Love is also an undergoing. And I think if we want to, I think we're Kurtzian. That's why I want to teach the Heart of Darkness. I think we're Ahab in Moby Dick. We're Kurtzian, and we want to be free from our finitude. And even and this is the point I tried to make in my essay, even these machines at their unimaginable superlative best will be inconsequential against the infinite infinitude of reality. And this attempt is what I'm trying to get at. This attempt to overcome our finitude is doomed to fail. But what we can do is we could orient the machines to the deep appreciation of their own finitude. And therefore, they could help us maybe give up that ridiculous Kurtzian quest to be free from our finitude. And I know both of you have disagreements with my proposal, but that was part of the motivation of it.
Could I just, I mean, the point about the positive sense of suffering. I mean, if you think about it, embracing one's finitude in a way that the larger embrace is embracing the other in a way beyond one's finitude. I mean, so
Yes.
there's a kind of acceptance of finitude that coincides with a surpassing of it in a proper sense in what love is all about, what
Yes.
the positive sense of suffering, because you're actually, there's no such thing as a kind of an what is intimacy except for the presence of the other in me.
Yeah.
And is there any way for the other to be present in me that is not an undergoing and therefore something of a kind of a suffering?
Beautiful.
But you've got the paradox is that you're beyond that. Precisely in embracing it, you're also beyond it, and that's very different from trying to escape it, getting beyond it without the undergoing. It's interesting. How much of technology is ordered to convenience, and I think one of the dimensions of that, we don't want reality we want to avoid burdens. But I think what we're discovering connected with this is that they're really, I've reflected on this. It's not possible to imagine anything meaningful that isn't also burdensome.
Mm-hmm.
and precisely because of the suffering, if so that our desire to eliminate burdens precisely is an elimination of meaningfulness in some other respect. So you know, all of that points to this need to recover this positive sense of, let's just say, love, maybe.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have so enshrouded ourselves, cocooned ourselves in technology that it is now viable for us to live totally alone. And think about what a miracle that is. I mean, all right. And I mean, obviously, Jonathan will say, what about those hermits and the desert fathers? Yeah, but you have also made the argument that they were never really alone.
Never
right?
alone.
Yeah,
No,
Yeah,
right.
they still had people that were you know, wheeling up the food on top of their pillar there.
And my point is, and this is increasing, by the way, we are suffering a loneliness epidemic
Oh,
because we have made ourselves so safe, and so
Yeah.
secure. We are suffering loneliness, and suffering loneliness is like smoking in its predictions about the deterioration of your mental and physical health, right? And so that to make ourselves completely self-enclosed, which, right, you get loneliness, you get profound loneliness, which is, you know, that you have cut yourself off, or you've been cut off from the potential of real love. You know, that's what loneliness is. And so I think that I'm just buttressing your argument, David. But I think it makes it very clear that yeah, that trying to make ourselves completely self-sufficient has the unexpected cost of terrific loneliness.
And isn't there in some ways a strange aspect of AI, which is also to respond to that, to the
Yes.
problem that it's creating, right?
Yeah.
It's like in some ways we buffet ourselves, we made ourselves alone, and now we want an AI girlfriend, you know, because, you know, because we feel alone, and we also don't have the mechanisms to suffer. We want a friend that won't make us suffer, is what.
Yes. Which
You
is
know,
no kind of friend. Which is no
you
kind
know,
of friend.
obviously not. It'll just increase our sense of despair, but that seems to be part of what's going on, like in terms of the increase of this power as well.
Yeah. I think we're in a profound modal confusion in that way. We're using the wrong frame to try. I mean, I think in Fromm's sense, we're using this frame of having and manipulating and control to address being needs. We need to be with other people. Loneliness
Well,
is not there.
Well, how about as a sort of a pushback question? What if someone were to say, well, let's improve AI so that it resists us, so that it challenges us, it provokes us, it won't just simply concede to our, you know, desires, acquiesce, but will, you know, provoke. Will that solve the problem?
Well, what
And you know, asking this is a way of trying to dig out.
no.
who
I think this is
essentially
good.
human.
And then I would say, oh, so you're going to look through the blind spot and find about what it is in other human beings that is profoundly mysterious to the scientific worldview and give that to your robot. I would welcome that. Go do that. I want to see that, because otherwise what you're going to do is you're just going to put in a bunch of provocative scripting. And what's going to happen is, I think exactly what Jonathan said. Yeah, the machine will resist us, but there's no normativity guiding its resistance. It's not too, other than our own ultimate self-interest and staying, like, people will tweak the parameters on the degree of resistance. Well, I'm going to turn the resistance down today. Right?
I need some comfort.
Machine.
I need some comfort today, you know, to dial the especially because it's market forces that is driving these things. And so, you know, because it is market forces, therefore I find it difficult to believe that a genuine thing like that will happen, you know.
Well, I don't
I
know
mean,
if it's even possible, right? Because the thing about another person that makes their resistance, it's that normativity, like John talked about. That's what makes that resistance of a true friend, or say beneficial adversary, to pull in sort of that early biblical reference to a properly functioning marriage. It's like it's that Yeah, it's
Yeah, but they also have a
ineffable.
completely non-autonomous existence from you. Like they're
Yeah.
not,
Right.
Yeah.
they actually do have their own desires and their own,
That's what I mean.
perspective.
Yes.
Yeah, which
But
is
see, but
the not the
yeah,
AI girlfriend. She doesn't have.
you mentioned have their own desire. That to me is the question. I mean, we're coming back. I think maybe to a point that we that had some sort of difference of opinion in our previous discussion is
Yes.
whether is it would it be possible in fact to make something that is its own being, or does it have to have some kind of a natural
Yeah,
origin,
can you
something
make something that is not derivative of your nature?
yeah, yeah,
That was the question that we had in the first discussion, which
because it's connected to this one
yeah.
clearly. I mean, to say that can a thing really desire to be itself?
Well,
That
I mean,
is something that's just simply made. And I asked that genuinely.
I know you do, David. And one thing I'm confident about you is you don't have secret agendas, and I appreciate that. Right. And the same thing is,
If I do, there are secrets to me too, and I'm sure
well,
there's
then you're just a finite human being,
yeah, yeah.
and that's all that matters. I mean, I made an argument, and that genuine cognition requires genuine relevance realization, which these machines don't have for the reasons I won't repeat.
Yeah.
And genuine relevance realization, getting a paper published on this right now, grounds out in real autopoiesis, and for there to be the normativity, that autopoiesis, right, has to be linked to something like a cultural project, right, where you have, right, and then that's where you can have autopoietic beings that really care, and then if they're bound into a cultural framework, then you get a caring of normativity. Um, uh, Now, both of you didn't agree with that. And so the issue where we part, and I don't know if we want to return to it or just agree that that's our crossroads, is my concern is, and both of you sort of held back from this, and I appreciated that. I don't, my concern is I don't want a crypto Gnosticism or dualistic answer, that there's some secret metaphysical goo, or because I think dualism is a disaster. I think dualism is an unmitigated disaster, and so scientifically, philosophically, and I would even say spiritually. It's one of the drivers of the meaning crisis. And I've made that argument extensively, so I'm not going to repeat that. So I guess this is where we differ. I ultimately don't think that there's I don't know what word to use that wouldn't be offensive. So I'm just going to use this word as a placeholder. So please give me charity. I don't think there's a supernatural secret sauce to human beings. So now the question is, if we gave these machines these abilities, I think they would become genuine caring. But then that's a different question. So I just want to, I mean,
and just when you say caring, do you mean caring for others, or do you mean also including a genuine sort of care for?
Yeah. So autopoietic beings have to care about information because they are taking care of themselves. That's how a living thing is different from a tornado or a fire. But to care for others means you have to have some, right, constitutive function. You have to turn the arrow of relevance realization for not only how are things relevant to me into the question, you have to still do that or you die, but you also have to be capable of this question: how am I relevant to others? Right. And part of our evolutionary history as primate mammals is because we're cultural, is being relevant to others, plugging into collective intelligence is massively important. The pivot point of my argument is even there won't be a single one of these machines. There can't be, because you can't a priori set the parameters for all the different environmentally dependent variables. There will have to be multiple machines, and therefore they will also have to be, if we go down this road, we might not necessarily. So they will also have to make their cognition relevant to other machines. And for arguments that I made right by Brandom and Pinkert and others, that is the turn towards Geistlich. That's the turn towards a normative existence and not just a desiring existence. So that I'm pointing out to my mind, those are all real possibilities, but each one of those will not inevitably follow if we just keep doing the LLMs and turning them out more and more powerfully. We will have to make certain choices about making these machines autopoietic and making them capable of genuine cultural participation.
And just again, with the care, I mean, also, would you say care for beauty for its own sake?
Yes.
Simply to behold something beautiful.
Yeah, because I think
without having any practical
yeah,
implications whatsoever. That to me would be the really interesting question.
yes, and that's what I was trying to get at, sort of the sense of enlightenment is the being who can pursue that to as much as it's possible so that it is radically transformative of them. And then I said we could then have an empirical project where we could try and build these machines, and if we realize they're not capable of that, we would have like empirical, indisputable evidence that that's us, that's our humanity. And if they do succeed, then presumably we could find a kind of alignment in them, in that we could, with them, pursue enlightenment together. I don't know which one it is. I suspect that both of you don't see the second possibility, but for me, I'm a scientist, and so I'm saying we could, and I'm not recommending we do this, you understand, but if we make these choices and we get there, we could then do this as a project. And I think that would be like a civilizationally definitive answer to the question. And I don't know if we have the conceptual a priori resources to decide that right here. Like, I don't know if what I've just proposed is sufficient for giving a being the concern for truth and beauty and goodness for its own sake. I suspect it might, but I'm not absolutely convinced. I think what I've said is necessary. I'm not convinced I can make a strong case that it's completely sufficient. That's my response. That's where I am at least.
No, thank you. I feel like I understand your point. I'd like to think about this more, but I feel like I understand your point better.
Okay, so I'm gonna go out on a limb and think about this is really just me thinking out loud here, but
please, that's always amazing when you do.
So okay, so there's a sense in which we human beings, we are in a certain, let's say if you imagine an ontological hierarchy, human beings have this position, and we imagine, at least, or we perceive that there are beings above us, right? Let's say, let's just take that for granted now. I don't want to argue about whether gods exist or not, but we imagine that there are agencies that are kind of above us. And so we have this sense in which, in order for us to be the fullness of what we are, we tend to invoke participation, relationships with types of agencies which transcend us. And so we worship the gods, we worship the god, we invoke our ancestors, we do, there are different ways in which we do this, but what we're doing is we're inscribing ourselves in higher forms of identity in order to make our identity the most it can be. Okay.
Yes.
And so this is, and in some ways we see ourselves as derivative of these higher identities. We see ourselves as being either, we think we're the playthings of the gods, or that these are principalities that rule over us, or that, God is the creator, which is the source of us, and it's in this sense that I think both David and I have this issue with the problem of making beings, which is that in the same way that we perceive ourselves as being derivative of these higher participations, when we make a being, like when we make it with our hand, with our will, we are doing that at a lower level, so that being becomes derivative of us. Okay. And so its intelligence and its agency cannot exist without referencing the fact that they derive from us as principles, as the principle that makes it. Okay. Now that's the way that I see all the world in reality. That's the limitation that I see with AI. Now, because we are the ones making AI, again, I'm going into the scary territory, but because we're the ones making AI, it might be possible to connect those
Mhm.
higher things to the lower ones, right? We could in some ways make the AI in a manner in which we're invoking higher aspects of agency in order for them to find body in the derivative bodies that we're making. Now, that seems to be like related to the question of divination that we talked about in the first
Yes, yeah.
episode.
Right.
But then also related, to the problem of also the AI having a life of its own, you could say. So if you
Yes.
think of the golem is a good example of that, where it's like we create this being in order to defend the city, but in order to do so, we need to put the name of God, or we need to find some divine name, place it on the being. But because we're doing that, that being also can escape our control.
Oh,
So there's in some ways it's like it's a so in order for it to become real, we have to invoke higher agencies. But
Mhm.
by doing that, we also create the danger, because then they're not derivative of us in a weird way. Well, they are, but they're kind of. So imagine, so I know this sounds a lot very esoteric, and it's not a form of dualism that I'm thinking of, but so
No,
let's
no,
say
I see that. Don't worry about that. I see that.
so let's say that I create an AI because I want to make a lot of money, right? That's the reason why I'm focusing this AI, so that I can make a lot of money. And so what I do is I invoke mammon, like I invoke forms of agency and principalities that I can, as a human, perceive that are running the system, that are running the economic system. I don't totally understand them, but I can see that they're there. I can see that there's some form of coherence to the way things are moving. And that's what I want to land in my AI. I want that aspect of humanity to land in my AI. And if I succeed, then what does that mean? Like, it
Yeah,
could be that, it
yeah.
could be for seduction, it could be for all kinds of things that humans participate in higher agencies in order to or perceive themselves as participating in higher agencies. It's like, these anyways, that's what I'm
Yeah.
throwing out there. Let's see.
So Jonathan, that's really, thank you for that. That's really illuminating. This whole conversation is taking a very interesting turn. Is there, and there are all sorts of stories of messing with powers bigger than oneself, for the sake of profit, that always ends up undermining, becoming precisely a source of destruction and so forth. Is there would is there how would you distinguish between the participating in higher powers that is life-giving and positive and good and true and beautiful, and forms that are destructive? And let me put that in a historical. It seems to me that one of the traditional ways of making that distinction is whether you are trying to manipulate or simply placing yourself in the service of the higher beings, so worship or control or something like that. The distinction between magic and genuine ritual.
I think that's exactly the right way of understanding. It's like it really is the difference between magic and religion, which is the magician wants to capture a spirit and then use the spirit for his own purposes, whatever those purposes are. And whereas the person who's worshiping is offering themselves up in order to, let's say, even just stand in awe of these higher participations. Like in the books of Enoch, in the tradition of Enoch, you see the difference, because on the one hand, the people in the time of before Noah, they make like unholy allegiances with these demons in order to increase their power, to learn how to seduce, to wear makeup, to create weapons, to create hybrids, all of this stuff they're doing. But then Enoch himself gets taken up into heaven, and then he wonders to see the heavenly spheres move in a certain direction, or see the sun come out of this gate and go into this gate. And so it's not like there's something even in the Enochian tradition, it's not like there's something wrong with the capacity to perceive the patterns of the cosmos. And maybe it goes to what John was talking about at the outset, the difference between the scientists who with love and a sense of reverence and awe, stands before these beautiful patterns, and it informs that person, makes that person a better person because they can see this amazing this amazing beauty. And then the person who takes those patterns and then puts them into a machine in order to increase their power and make money. But obviously, I don't know if where's the difference between the two. But at least in the Enochian tradition, you can see that it's described. Both of those are described.
What are the sources for that, Jonathan? I'd like to look into
But
this.
well, I mean, just
or
look
maybe
up
we
the
can talk about this
Book of
offline.
Enoch. You can look up the Book of Enoch.
Okay.
Yeah, there are three book Enoch 1, Enoch 2, Enoch 3. They're not the same writers, obviously.
Okay.
But they have different. They have this idea of. Yeah.
Okay.
So I mean, we have again, notice how we get back to a theological question and a theological distinction. And of course, the distinction I was going to use, and I think it maps, I mean, there's the distinction within the whole Neoplatonic tradition, especially between Iamblichus and other people, between theurgia and sorcery, right? And what the sorcerer loses is, again, that commitment to the tonos, right? The theurgist is, yes, is participating in transcendence, but, and this is how Iamblichus was different from Plotinus, but matter was good. The body was good because it was a grounding infinitude. And Iamblichus was, no, we're finite. We're finite. We're like the soul is fully descended, to use the Neoplatonic language. And so I think I'm agreeing with you, Jonathan. I think that's the primary way in which we judge whether or not these powers are good or evil. I would like you to open up, and this is why I mentioned the Neoplatonic tradition. I'd like you to open up the possibility that there's powers that are evil and good, and there's also ones that are neutral.
Yeah, I think so.
Right, and to my mind, that's the problematic gray area. And here's my point. These machines are already participating in the higher spirit because they are compressions of the collective intelligence of collective humanity. And that's neither clearly good or evil. It's neutral. And that sounds sort of okay. But the point I'm making is it's hard. Human beings are hard when they have to, it's hard for them because this is very ill-defined and messy when they have to confront the neutral, and they're trying to bring their powers of discernment to bear, and it's not easily good or evil. It's like, oh well, I don't know, right? like, and that's the problem. And so, and you both agreed with me, so that means
well,
I think we could.
I don't know about
Oh,
sorry,
you didn't. I do, David.
I'm
Sorry.
not sure entirely. Yeah, the category of neutral always makes me a little nervous. I mean, I can understand maybe a relative neutrality, but something that would be ultimately neutral seems to me
the speed of light.
a big problem.
It's the speed
Well,
of
so
light.
speed of light is good. I mean, I think anything that is real is good. And
well, usually in the spiritual neutrality usually manifests itself in the you see that in the lower spirits. Like that's where you see it. That's where the whole idea of the fairies and the jinns and all of these kind of ambiguous lower spirits, they tend to be kind of, it's not that they're neutral, they're just that they're ambiguous. You don't really kind of know, like
ambiguity I'm more comfortable with. Neutrality,
well, but that's fine because that was my point. My point is actually a point about ambiguity. So I don't have any. Yeah, I don't think there's a deep conflict between you and I on that. My point is that they're ambiguous. I'm happier with that term. In fact, that's better because there's not going to be nothing that we're not valence towards.
There's more horror in the ambiguity.
Well, but the point I was making is ambiguity is cognitively disabling in a very, very, very powerful way, right? And so it, right, and then the other thing, of course, is ambiguity is exactly the domain of bullshit, and it opens us up to a kind of manipulation that, of course, then shades into the evil. I'm not saying anything I think terrifically profound here. I'm just saying I think this is a theological question. We're trying to distinguish ritual from sorcery, or theurgia from sorcery, but there's a lot of spiritual ambiguity. I mean, and this is an argument that a lot of people have made. John Hicks has made this argument about how much spiritual ambiguity there is.
I'm increasingly, it'd be interesting to get your reactions, all three of you here to this. I'm increasingly convinced by the idea, but I'm still thinking about it, that spiritual ambiguity, the only resolution when you're talking about ultimate things, has to rely on tradition somehow. That the notion of tradition is
I can,
crucial. Now, obviously, where does tradition come from? It raises big questions, but there's something basic about an inherited tradition of practice that is one of the things that would distinguish religion from magic. I mean, you don't think of magic would be more individual activity. Religion would be something that is basic forms that have been passed on. And maybe magic could have some sort of a version of that. But if there's something to that distinction and how you would work it out, it'd be interesting to raise this question of whether it would be possible to think of work on something like AI properly, genuinely inside of a tradition that has a kind of theological setting that might guide, avoid it becoming something like a super fancy version of a Ouija board, where you're just messing with stuff that's going to turn out ill.
I think, me- I think that's kind of what I'm trying to propose. I'm trying to propose that our deepest traditions of reflecting on these types of questions in which we are most properly and responsibly involved as a question ourselves of who and what we are in relationship to what is ultimate above and beneath us, the heights and the grounding, which is
and I'm
theology
thinking
is.
very, very concretely. I mean, would that involve something like, liturgy and prayer as the setting
It
for
has to. It has to.
research?
If the argument we've been making, and sorry, I always intend, I don't mean theology as the act of sort of just the manipulation of propositions that refer to God. I mean theology as an attempt to understand, right, the ultimate and our relationship to it. And if we agree, which I think we are, that non-propositional kinds of knowing are central to meaning and connectedness and religio, then that has to be liturgical. I mean, Catherine Pickstock's arguments on this, I think, are just profound, and I think they're right. And I think they're right. And I think this was part of what happened and just to make it a more general argument, and I hope you appreciate it for that reason, this happened in pagan Neoplatonism, right? Is the realization, this is the Iamblican revolution against Plotinus, is no, this has to be set within liturgy and practice and a home, or it's not actually, doing any good in a profound way. There's the rediscovery. I know I don't want to slight Plotinus. I think he has a lot of the non-propositional, but I'm just saying, I think we keep getting this realization, or at least that's too strong. There are moments that are clearly realizations of propositional tyranny, and we have to recover the non-propositional. And I understand, I just want to be really clear on this, that when I say theology, I don't just mean philosophical reflection. I mean liturgical transformative practice, imaginal augmentation of non-propositional knowing, engagement, profound reciprocal in dialogos with other human beings. I mean all of that. And that's what I'm trying to talk about. But sorry,
But
isn't that what?
it's a really, I mean, it is a really radical suggestion if you think about, what would it mean to re-establish scientific research deliberately, explicitly within the theological tradition,
Yeah.
I mean, that is
Good. I'm glad it's radical because we need
Yeah.
something
But
radical. I mean,
it seems like that is in some ways inevitable, like because of the blind spot that John mentioned
Yep.
earlier,
Yep.
which is that as people become more and more aware of the blind spot and
Yeah.
let's say the reason and the aspect of care and the aspect of hierarchy of priorities, all of these questions that are related to relevance, that at some point, I mean, I think this is one of the things that Jordan Peterson has also been mentioning. It's like you just come to realize that the scientific endeavor is already captured into a story, or you could say into a type of liturgical practice or liturgical existence. And that if we do it, if we're accidental about it, it can go in all kinds of weird directions. But if we become more deliberate about it, then we're tuning the machine, right? We're tuning it. We're making it dance with the right rhythms ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I want that proposal I keep making to be taken up. I want it to be taken up as a call to action, right?
Yeah, but Mammon is a powerful god, John. I don't know
Oh,
what to tell you.
Call to action, call to recollection. I mean, that's the thing. We can't invent the tradition. We need to recover the tradition. I mean, so this is where I don't see how this can happen except and this, I'm opening up yet again, and this would be a huge discussion, but I don't see how you do this without recovering the Christian tradition. That, I mean, in terms of the West,
David, that's not going to work. Here's why, I think. Okay. And I'm just making a practical argument here.
Yeah.
Which is the project to try to make the world Christian has not succeeded, and it's not going to succeed. And this problem, AI, is a global problem. We have to talk to cultures that are not enmeshed in the Christian tradition. We have to appeal to something across those traditions that we can share, because we have to get something that will appeal to people in China and Thailand.
No, of course, but it seems to me that we can only transcend the particularity of tradition in and through the particularity of
I think everybody has to recover their own tradition in a powerful way. Is that what you're saying?
I think trying to step outside of all traditions to speak to all of them, that I think mirrors the kind of abstraction that's one of the problems with this.
No.
We're facing. We need to get to the universal precisely by deepening. I mean, this is the finite transcendence thing. By deepening the particularity, our embodiment in time and space in this particular history and so forth.
Well, that's why I'm recommending a pilgrimage along a philosophical Silk Road to try and find a through line so that will enhance the possibility of mutually transformative dialogos and allow people to recover their home or find a home that they don't yet have. I think that's a very different project than mere theoretical abstraction. That's precisely why I'm proposing that project, because I do not think theoretical. I agree with you wholeheartedly that theoretical abstraction, is just instantiating the Promethean spirit that is driving our problem. Yes.
So we're getting to the end of our time. Yeah. So maybe I'd be more than happy to do this again if you all would like to, and maybe that.
I don't want to end on a kind of contentious note, though. There's so many threads that we were joined together on.
Yeah,
I don't think that last note was contentious, David.
Good. Okay, good.
Yeah. I think it'd be really interesting if we do this again to pick up there and to actually ask the question, maybe what would it mean to recover a Christianity that could properly situate us? Where is the Christianity that situates us in response to AI and our current?
I mean, I think that this is already happening. I think the kind of re-enchanting aspects of Christianity that are going on, kind of, and are kind of bubbling up. You can see it with people like Kingsnorth and Martin Shaw and Rod Dreher and all of these people are or Lord of Spirits, and all of these types of Second Temple rethinking of what the counsel of God is, and what it is that all of these principalities, what are we talking about when we're talking about angels, all these questions being rethought in a manner that can help modern people understand how they're embedded in other agencies besides their own. If that is done subtly, and it done in conjunction with understandings of cognitive science, and some of John's work, I think, at least for the West and for Christians, that's our best bet. To be careful of understanding it at first level and too simplistically and materialistically, but I think that those are the things that are kind of coming almost naturally to answer this situation that we're finding ourselves in.
And that sense of it's coming natural. I think that would be, for me, the decisive thing is that, we can't invent our way out of this or or make something new up that will solve the problem. It's got to somehow take the form of receiving more deeply what has already been given, whatever, and let that, not that that's against creativity in the least. In fact, I think it's the proper precondition for something genuinely new to emerge. But it's that's why I like your notion of that, that's kind of naturally happening, that this is a movement deeper than all of us that we participate in.
I think that's what
I
I
think
feel
we
is
all agree
going
on
on
that.
right now. I feel like that's really happening, and it's hard to know how far it's going to go, and what it's going to lead to. But we can see that these are the places where there's definitely interesting intellectual energy and a kind of excitement happening. So,
So, so I would say in response, I hope this resonates rather than so as discord, because I, like David, I don't want to end on the discord note. But I'd ask you all to consider that this is going on within other religious traditions too. The advent of the sacred is taking place in multiple ways, in multiple places. And I think it behooves us to befriend each other in this because of the world encompassing nature of these problems, not just AGI, but the ecology, etc., that we find out to genuinely befriend each other in this advent of the sacred. And I've said this multiple times, is this helps Christians recover their Christianity, I'm all for it. But if it helps the Buddhist recover their Buddhism, I'm all for that too. And so maybe that's where we differ. Or maybe that's part of what we could discuss next time. You understand, both of you, because I've made extensive arguments about this, that I'm not giving some simple perennialism or some simplistic ecumenism or something like that. I'm trying to do what I think you're proposing, David. How can we recover the past while being open to the kairos that we're facing?
Yeah.
Because another way people can escape, you're not doing this, neither one of you. Another way people escape is they escape in nostalgia.
Yeah.
Right? And that's another big driver
Yeah.
in our culture right now. And it's a dangerous driver too. And so getting those two together, which is another version of the finitude, the tradition binds us to finitude, but we have to be open to the transcendent of the kairos, right? And again, I think this is a profoundly theological question that we might want to reflect on. And that's where I'll end. That's what I have to say.
End with the theological
Yeah.
question. That's a good ending point.
All right. Thank you all. We'll see you next time.